Thank you, Senator. Next, we will hear from Senator Blackburn. Senator Blackburn, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here to talk about this issue today. And Ms. Baker, I want to start with you first. An issue that you've heard me talk about regularly is having an inventory of all the spectrum that is held by federal agencies. And I would like for you to speak to the importance of why we ought to do this as we look at re-upping this spectrum authority and why it would be useful to have this as we look at this 5G build out.
Thank you for the question, Senator. It's an important one, and I'll go back to the next spectrum we allocate needs to be mid-band, and the mid-band is government spectrum. 2/3 of the mid-band is government spectrum. So we need to know what's there, so an inventory would be very helpful so we can know who's using that spectrum efficiently and who's not. That'll help us as we use the Spectrum Relocation Fund that this committee so brilliantly passed and has been so useful in relocating agencies. I think as we move forward, it's important to know what's there. It's important to know what the value is and how it's being utilized so that we know what's needed to reallocate it.
Absolutely. And Mr. Vanna, I want to come to you because she mentioned the different federal agencies that kind of compete. And recently we've seen what I would call a lot of sharp elbows between DOD and FCC and NTIA and let's see, FAA and other agencies, DOT. So why is it important for us? What are your recommendations to minimize this, and how would an inventory help us to minimize these differences between agencies and these turf battles that seem to be coming about over this mid-band spectrum?
Thank you, Senator Blackburn, for that question. I would just first mention that there is an inventory of federal spectrum uses that NTIA holds. It's the government master file. We have some ongoing work, actually, that was mandated through the last NDAA for us to look at how various systems such as that are holding that information and making changes and updates to those systems. So I would just mention that there's a couple of things that that government master file may not have. It would be things like where the spectrum might be used or the time at which that spectrum is used. And so, that would be information that would be useful for reallocating spectrum in certain circumstances or finding out places where spectrum could be shared. But I would go back to the recommendations that we have in our reports with respect to how we can avoid some of these disputes between agencies in the future. And that really goes to coordination amongst the agencies and NTIA engaging with those agencies early on and anticipating where FCC might be going with certain proceedings in terms of the reallocation towards to non-federal uses. I think the MOU, again, goes a long way. It's a great first step in terms of making those early coordination opportunities happen.
Well, and I think that one of the things you mentioned, sharing spectrum, because we do have some agencies that leave that spectrum just lying unused for long periods of time, and that is spectrum that could be shared. Dr. Baselin, I want to come to you. I'm interested in your understanding of the CBO scoring that you mentioned in your testimony, and it seems like with your prior career experience at CBO that you would have some helpful insight into how scoring might factor into what a potential reauthorization of the Spectrum Auction Authority would look like. Now, when I was in the House and chaired the Comms and Tech subcommittee there at Energy and Commerce, and we worked on the Ray Bombs Act, it was a big point of conversation, how this was going to end up being scored. So in your view, what are the pros and cons of an 18-month reauthorization as opposed to going ahead and doing like a 1-year or 4-year reauthorization?
Thank you for the question. If the reauthorization for 18 months allows for the work to be done to have more directed scoring in a longer bill, that could be useful. But we all appreciate that at the end of the day, we want the Spectrum Authority to be there for a long time. Even if you extend the authority for 4 years or 10 years, there is still an opportunity for Congress to come in and have directed reallocations. And those reallocations will score positively. They won't score as high as they would if they also included the authorization aspect of it, but they would still have a positive score. And so it's a trade-off and a judgment as to whether or not a longer term is necessary.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.